In a year full of game releases that sort of felt like miracles, Dead Island 2 really caught my eye. Like everyone who was even slightly into games at the time, I vividly remember that first Dead Island trailer, and following that, the slew of spin-offs, and the near-constant delays and revolving door of developers of its numbered sequel. It took Dead Island 2 12 years, 4 studios, a multi-billion-dollar acquisition, and at least one celebrity impersonator to get out the door. And while it didn't sweep the Game of the Years like some other Miracle game releases, it was still a commendable effort. So it's time we take a look at the hectic development of Dead Island 2. In 2011, publisher Deep Silver wanted more Dead Island, and frankly, they wanted it quickly. It was understandable. While not a critical darling, for a new IP, the first game had sold incredibly well, moving around 5 million units in 12 months. It was a simple game, part Left 4 Dead and part Far Cry, with a satisfying proto-looter-shooter gameplay loop and a colorful tone that set it apart from other games in its genre that weren't Dead Rising. Developer Techland, however, wanted to do something bigger. When approaching the publisher with their ideas for a sequel, it was obvious the two parties were on separate pages. Deep Silver would call it too ambitious, and Techland would fulfill their contract instead with a smaller scale release from a satellite studio with Dead Island Riptide, while taking the team that had created the first game and working on a new IP, this time one they had complete control over. That would come in the form of Dying Light, another melee-focused zombie game that Techland was adamant was entirely different than Dead Island, and one of the many different types of games and stories that could be made with zombies. This is really half true. While the moment-to-moment of Dying Light is very different, with its heavy focus on maneuvering and traversal over the chaotic hack-and-slash energy of Dead Island, there's still that distinct Techland flair here. Between reused assets, similar but definitely improved mission structure, and that slightly greasy character modeling seen with every iteration of their proprietary engine, it's hard to not think that this was very similar to the game they pitched to Deep Silver. But that's not to say Dying Light is a cheap copy, or their sequel in everything but name. It stands on its own, was received incredibly well, and created a world that was tense and fun in all the right ways. While I personally miss the more colorful tone of the Dead Island series, it's hard to not get lost in the world they created, and spend far too much time maneuvering. With Techland out of the picture in 2012, Deep Silver would reach out to potential studios, with former Spec Ops: The Line developer Yager Development finding themselves pitching a sequel that took place in a walled-off quarantine California. With a more campy tone and a story penned by former Witcher and future Days Gone writer Ann Toole, it was clear to Deep Silver that Yager's potential sequel was much more in line with what the publisher thought Dead Island could be. However, from the very beginning, the game was rigged against them. According to a former Deep Silver employee speaking with Game Informer's Blake Hester for the retrospective on Yager's development of the project, the expectations for whatever studio got Dead Island 2 were always unrealistic. Then Deep Silver parent company Koch Media would notoriously lowball their budget expectations, open up to pitches, and then accept an even lower bid. When Yager came in with the cheapest offering, which was part of the reason their pitch was greenlit, Koch and Deep Silver were aware that this was probably unrealistic. That, on top of being one of the first developers to license the brand new next-generation Unreal 4, what was intended as a not-too-ambitious project was shaping up already to be a big headache for Yager. Almost immediately, Deep Silver would request something they called seamless multiplayer.
And we're like, well, what does seamless multiplayer mean? And they say, well, we don't really know. You figure it out.
While Yager pictured something akin to, quote, the world's smallest MMO, or even something similar to, say, Journey, more modern patterns point to games like The Division, where a group of players inhabit the same world, but aren't explicitly playing co-op. In 2013 or so, however, the only real high-profile usage of the phrase seamless multiplayer was in the lead-up to the release of Watch Dogs, where early showcases would demonstrate a world where players could stalk each other or hack into each other's single-player games. It's clear that Deep Silver didn't quite know what they wanted, but at the time, early live service ideas were all the rage, and the original's co-op had already laid some of the initial groundwork to feel more competitive in the early games-as-a-service market. Yager would move instead to turn their co-op slasher into the aforementioned world's smallest MMO. A world would remain persistent for the up to 8 players in a game, and would stay that way until the last person logged out. It encouraged a more drop-in, drop-out approach, and kept the game feeling laid back compared to the more competitive live service offerings at that time.
Wake up in the morning to the clear blue sky. Turn up the music when I hop in the ride.
At E3 2014, Yager would officially announce Dead Island 2 with a trailer set on the beach in Santa Monica. It was a welcome surprise and was targeting a release date of spring 2015, just under a year from then. At the end of the trailer, voices could be heard from two characters that sounded like both Jack Black and Aaron Paul.
Sweet!
Come on, dude, time to split.
Freaking awesome!
Let's go.
Dude, chill. I got this.
While people were quick to speculate their involvement, Jack Black would confirm in a Reddit AMA a few days later that he wasn't involved, suggesting instead that it was the same voice actor who played Poe in the Kung Fu Panda TV series, Mick Wingert. Wingert would confirm on Twitter shortly after. His character Max, which was featured heavily in the Yager version of Dead Island 2, would also be the main character in the arcadey spin-off Dead Island Retro Revenge. Any word on who sounded like Aaron Paul, however, remains a mystery. Behind closed doors at that E3, media would be shown a build of the game that was from all the way back in 2013. By all accounts, it looked a bit rough, and confused media as to why they would show off a version so old. Part of that was due to how rough development had been going, despite Deep Silver and some Yager higher-ups being insistent on that spring 2015 release. Riptide had released in 2013, and coming up in the fall another spin-off, Escape Dead Island, was also set to be released. With a launch window for 2 in 2015, Deep Silver was poised to have a franchise with projects coming out yearly. But most at Yager, who were still trying to wrap Unreal Engine 4 around an open world and multiplayer it was obviously not built for, were confident the numbered sequel wouldn't release until at least 2016. That wouldn't stop a more recent build from showing up at both Gamescom in August and EGX in October, showing a version of the game set in the Hollywood Hills with a warm, colorful tone, the signature junk hoarding, and a focus on even more improvised weapons. It looked great, continuing to buck the dark and gritty tone of the genre, and showed a hopeful vertical slice that was frankly never as good as things looked behind the scenes. And with the announcement that pre-orders of the spin-off Escape Dead Island got priority for the Dead Island 2 beta just a few days later, it was looking like Dead Island 2 just might meet its deadline. Despite that, however, in spring of 2015, after a long period of silence, the game would be officially delayed into 2016, once again with no solid date. Internally, things did not look good. Outside help came from Deep Silver's studio Volition, whose suggestions came down to the scope of the world being too big for multiplayer and home consoles. Yager desperately would try a handful of solutions, going as far to break up the worlds into pieces rather than being relatively continuous, and scaling back the live game elements. Deep Silver, likely unhappy that these clashed with the aforementioned seamless multiplayer, would announce that they had parted ways with Yager Development in July of 2015, and the project would go quiet. Years later, in 2020, an incredibly late-in-the-game build of Yager's work would leak online. Dated in June of 2015, less than a month before the team was officially pulled from the project, it provides an incredibly detailed look at what they were trying to do. While I'm not an expert in pre-release builds or the finer details of game development like this, it seems to be an internal vertical slice of a few sections of maps and a boss battle to show Deep Silver higher-ups. I'm purely speculating, but following Deep Silver's shell game trick of parent companies after parting with Yager and their transition to work from home at the start of the pandemic, it was likely sitting on an internal server somewhere and got dumped online. It's also noticeably less polished than what was seen at Gamescom and EGX from a year prior. That speaks more to how those demonstrations aren't necessarily accurate representations of the state of the game, and more pieces of marketing. Game development isn't linear, so it's interesting to take a peek inside the sausage as it's being made. Caveats aside though, there's quite a lot here, and honestly, it's very cool to play a build like this. It's a rarity to not see one that's bogged down by placeholder sound effects and textures, and actually has much of what is needed to be playable for more than just a few minutes. Missions function, combat and AI is somewhat in place, as well as XP, leveling, and vehicles with working radios full of licensed music. There's even some voice acting, including Max, the aforementioned character played by not Jack Black over your radio, who may also be this quest giver in the Malibu area. It also still has quite a bit of that Dead Island charm, with the loot everything approach, that colorful tone, and improvised weapons. This time around, specific types of crafting resources also come from specific stores in the overworld, creating a cool awareness of where you're at and what's nearby. It benefits from a more urban setting in interesting ways, that honestly I was afraid would make it feel more generic. There's also unfinished but interesting looks at the main gameplay loop and its story. Max and a few others refer to the player as one of the heroes, and most locations feature hero boards for providing aid to the community. While some interviews pitch Max as a superhero fanboy who sees the zombie-immune players as comic book characters come to life, your reliance on melee weapons, his 80s heavy metal aesthetic, some of the looks at the character in Retro Revenge, and that slightly meta MMO influence makes me feel like they were really going for a wandering band of heroes trope, seen in fantasy in a way that feels reminiscent of Edgar Wright's The World's End. Regardless, even in its unpolished form, there's real personality here. It's colorful, vehicles are odd little dune buggies, and quests are focused on getting NPCs iced coffees before they melt. There isn't much actual story here beyond the opening plane crash and subtle hints, but it's still somehow a fun world to explore. While I can see potential issues with the reliance on gunplay, their modifications still have that DIY feeling, and honestly doesn't feel like much help in close quarters. It feels very close to release. 2016 doesn't seem far from plausible, and without more context on what exactly wasn't up to snuff, it just feels weird that Yager was pulled from the project so late. To an outsider, Sumo Digital may not seem like the obvious choice to follow up Yager. Even internally at Deep Silver, employees were a tad confused.
Collectively, everyone in the office Googled, "What the fuck is Sumo Digital?" Realized that they had only done kart racing games and nothing that was rated over E for everybody.
While they were probably most known for Sonic All-Star Racing, Little Big Planet 3, and a handful of middling Doctor Who games, they'd also been tapped for another famously long development for Crackdown 3. In 2016, when their involvement in Dead Island 2 was announced, however, they were still sharing development with series creator Dave Jones' studio Regent Games, which had developed the famous cloud-based destruction engine creatively named CloudGen. Despite the marketing, however, Sumo Digital was always the lead developer, with Regent mostly focusing on tech development. It's interesting in hindsight, Sumo is now heading up two very important projects for two respective parent companies, both of which being sequels for kind of middle-of-the-road B games that arguably maybe didn't need to be huge tentpoles. But regardless, Crackdown's development was giving them some much-needed experience to diversify their skills. For Dead Island, however, Sumo's role was much more in re-examining and reworking Yager's builds into something that fit into Deep Silver's vision. Despite that, very little word on the project would come, with no new trailers or insight. Some rumors around the time pointed to the sequel being put fully on ice, no doubt due in part to Sumo's increased role on what felt like a bigger project. Deep Silver, however, would remain adamant that the project was still in development. It's unclear how much of this is actually true, or to be frank, how much work Sumo actually did on the project. However, in March of 2019, 3 years after they'd been announced, a financial report from Deep Silver's new parent company, THQ Nordic, who were only a few months out from rebranding to Embracer Group, would announce that they had entrusted their internal studio Dambuster with development of Dead Island 2. Sumo's only statement would be to IGN, simply stating that the report was correct and had no impact on their future or financial status. It was supposedly 3 years of work, and so it surprises me that there hasn't been any leaks or look at what they were doing. Though judging by the way they say being pulled off the project had no impact on their future, seems to imply that they'd either been off the project for some time or weren't very far along. Dambuster's studio story makes them a great fit for the whole Dead Island thing. And by that I mean they're a studio that's basically two-ish other studios in a trench coat trying to survive in a post-THQ world. On paper, the only game they'd ever officially worked on was Homefront: The Revolution, a sequel to the 2011 game published by THQ. During the crumbling of the publisher, the IP rights to Homefront would end up in the hands of Crytek of Can It Run Crysis fame. Following their purchase of the remaining pieces of Free Radical in 2009, after they'd been entered into administration when Battlefront 3 was cancelled, Crytek would hand Homefront 2 to the Timesplitters developer, now dubbed Crytek UK. When Crytek would go through their own series of massive restructures, they'd sell off Homefront to Koch Media and lay off Crytek UK. However, due to British employment laws, many of those employees would be retained at a new studio in Nottingham named Dambuster. In the midst of all of that, Koch Media would be acquired by THQ Nordic and so on, until Deep Silver, Dambuster, a newly reformed Free Radical, Homefront: The Revolution, and of course Dead Island 2 would all be under the rebranded Embracer Group. So while Dambuster seems inexperienced, their pedigree goes all the way back to at least Free Radical, and some even further back to Rare. That being said, it's worth pointing out that half as many people from Free Radical that worked on Dead Island 2 at Dambusters ended up at Sumo Digital instead, though it's unclear if they worked on their own version of the project, and that Free Radical was revived during this time, only to be shut down again the same year Dead Island 2 would finally release. For Dambuster, however, getting the keys to Dead Island 2 didn't mean the same thing it did to their predecessor. They had no intention of fixing, changing, or salvaging Yager's work. In the wake of the relatively mixed reception of Homefront: The Revolution, the studio wanted to narrow their focus when starting on their next game. With a team full of fans of 70s and 80s cult zombie flicks, they would make the move from CryEngine to Unreal and develop a gore-focused engine even before they were offered the sequel. It's something that reminds me a little bit of the development of Criterion's Black, where the goal was to have fun in an empty room. Dambuster had no intention of being bogged down in systems that barely worked, or bite off more than they could chew, instead wanting the fun to come from first-person melee combat first and foremost. Because of that, it feels like there's maybe a little bit of that Free Radical design punk rock DNA still rattling around a bit, being developed as a direct response to overbloated AAA games. When the project was shown off at Gamescom in 2022, there was actual gameplay, and a release date of February 3rd, 2023 that Dambuster intended to hit. They wouldn't, but late in 2022, they delayed only a few months into April, when the game would finally be released.
Yo, get the speaker box loud, hitting that stuff till you hearing that sound.
Calling the development a complete reboot is almost entirely accurate. While some of the broad strokes exist, nothing seems to be reused. For example, while both games start with an airplane crash, they're in two separate parts of LA. And while classes are similar, even going as far as reusing the fireman Ryan and the motorcycle stunt rider Danny, now named Carla, that's largely all that's the same. For one thing, Dead Island 2 is much more focused on just the Orange County area, rather than different cities across California. With its lack of even vehicles and less of a focus on side missions, it's arguably even more small scale than even the first game. But it makes up for it with interesting dungeon-like levels, better enemy variety, and an almost immersive sim approach to combat. Put plainly, Dead Island 2 is simple yet fun, remembering the past with returning power-ups and characters, but unafraid to have an identity that's all its own. It's surprising considering how many other studios clashed with Deep Silver over the years, but it's obvious from the way zombies' eyeballs popped out when you whack them, to how you can execute increasingly elaborate and frankly kind of stupid plans of attack, that Dambuster saw what the melee combat of the first game could be, and built something that was over the top and even a bit addictive. Even when it adds things like guns and bombs, it feels more like a supplement to your DIY arsenal rather than something you're always going to lean on. Something that likely wouldn't have been true for Yager's project, and only makes Dead Island 2 feel that much more unique. It's hard to picture what the future of the Dead Island series is. According to Deep Silver, the numbered sequel moved 2 million units in its first few months, their biggest success ever, following in the footsteps of the first game. But with the volatility of the development, the new parent company, and the massive layoffs at a wide range of Embracer studios, going as far as to close down Free Radical entirely, even consistently successful studios like Gearbox were at risk. We'll likely see another Dead Island game in some form, whether that's at Dambuster or some other studio that doesn't exist yet. It's a testament to the near-timeless desire to whack zombies over the head with increasingly elaborate contraptions. It's also a testament to the ever-moving goalposts, the expectations of publishers and parent companies that are more interested in a bottom line, marketable buzzwords like seamless multiplayer, and micromanagement. When Dead Island 2 made it over the line, it wasn't because of complicated systems and overbloated worlds. Dead Island 2 exists despite that. It was more than anything, passionate developers who understood and loved the first game, the genre, and what they were making. There's a confidence in the simplicity, and hopefully that's enough to give Dambusters a place in the industry for years to come.